Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we're doing something a little bit different. I've always been fascinated by different sound design techniques, and I was recently experimenting with a very strange technique involving some very heavy distortion. What came out of it was really not what I was expecting. So normally on this channel I do stuff for psytrance, but as you can see from the title, this is going to be about hardcore, and specifically hardcore kick synthesis. And the reason for this is I almost accidentally came across the exact technique that you would use to create a hardcore kick drum. And I found the sound design so interesting and so intriguing that I just wanted to share it with you guys, and hopefully you can learn something from that. So this is the project that I was experimenting in. As you can see, I have some recordings, a few different takes of it. And as I said, normally I do psytrance, so I'm normally not a hardcore producer. So for anybody who does hardcore production like full-time, please let me know if I'm getting close with the kicks, if they sound any good. For me, listening to hardcore every once in a while, it does sound like it, but maybe it's not clean enough. Here are just the examples for you to judge. So that's what I wanted to discuss today. I'm going to go through all three of the patches. What I first want to do is I want to quickly show you what inspired me to make this patch. So what I was doing is I was experimenting with this patch here, which is actually a psytrance synth. It's not going to sound any good because the BPM is all off, but this is what I was experimenting with. And the way that this patch works is, in essence, we have a sub oscillator outputting a sine wave 1 octave below a saw wave, and then it goes into this EQ, which kind of prepares it for the distortion. So this EQ is really just adding like a very strong spike at one frequency, which is then going to be distorted heavily by this zero square right here. And then you can do whatever processing or stuff that you want to do. In this case, for the psytrance synth, I went with the classical bandpass 24 with the random modulator on the filter cutoff. Now, while I was experimenting with this, I came across the kind of tone that you usually get from like hardcore kicks and even hardstyle kicks in many different harder genres where you have the distorted kick drum. What you'll usually find is that there's this very unique tone that you actually get from this kind of distortion. So I'm just going to go into the first patch to show you as an example. It's going to be a little bit more complicated because we're doing some modulations as well. But in essence, you can see we have a sub bass, we have a saw wave, and then it goes into a spike, into an EQ spike, and then into a distortion. So the reason why this works is we have, as I said, the sub bass and the saw, which are combining together, which then goes into the EQ band. And you can imagine that at this frequency, we are pushing this frequency so hard into the distortion that the overtones that are created from this frequency are going to dominate all of the other overtones that might be generated at lower or higher frequencies. So you get that very characteristic gritty tone from your kick drum. So to quickly run through the patch, what we're doing is we're using this for volume right here and right there. I'm also using it for the drive amount on this particular version. I have this envelope set up here with no release that is controlling the mix. The reason for this is we don't want any distortion after it. If I do give it a little bit of release, you can hear that it does kind of sound a little bit different. You get that final extra distortion, that final extra click. So this zero release is actually fairly important. Finally, we have this LFO2 here, which is just controlling the pitch of our kick. You can see here we have LFO2 set to the master tuning at around 50. It is unipolar modulation, and then without it, if I turn this macro down, you'll hear that without the pitch it doesn't really sound like a kick. So that kick idea just comes from the pitching effect of the whole synth, and that is controlling both the sub as well as oscillator A. So you can see this whole idea of the kick is actually quite simple, but it relies on this very intriguing sound design effect, right? Where we have the equalizer, one very strong peak, and then going into the cross shaper. And you will see that that's true for every single patch. So for example, this one here, it's again the same thing, a sub bass, a saw wave, we have a distortion. This time I decided to go for a little bit of a lower gain on the peak, and I again went to a distortion. Now, you might see that this distortion curve here, I'm using the X-Shaper, and there's a really cool trick that you can do with the X-Shaper. I didn't implement that in the last patch. In the last patch, I just decided to make my own custom shape. But what I did here is for shape A, I went and I just went from the default shape down. And then in shape B, I set up whatever distortion that I wanted. Now I recently made a video on how you should read this graph. So for anybody who isn't familiar with how you read this graph, there's a video out on my channel about this. In essence, what it will do is it will just boost all of the lower volumes. For those who have seen the volume will recall that this is a volume remap graph, or that's what I like to call them. The way that it works is that we have lowest volumes to highest volumes, and then we have lowest volumes to highest volumes up here, and it just takes a low volume and in this case remaps it to a very, very high volume here. So the reason why I went through all of that trouble is so that instead of having to deal with the mix and stuff like that, like I didn't last time, I can actually force it to become silent. Because if you look at the curve for graph A, it will take any volume and map it to silence, because obviously the lowest volume possible is silence. So in essence, this will make sure that my kick stays within the MIDI note, because there's no release. There's a little bit of attack, but that's okay. Now the reason why you have to do this, why you need to be so careful with the volume, making sure that it goes to 0 when the note stops playing, has to do with the kind of music that this really is. And it's because it's really, really loud music. You need to make sure that you keep the full loudness. So going down to 0 volume actually has an effect. Let's look at this kick drum here. So this is, I think, the best one that I've made out of the three in regards to loudness. You can see that it's just a sausage, right? We can ignore the post ringing of this one. You can see there's this little bit of post ringing. This is what happens when you don't go to 0. So this one is a little bit worse, as I would say. You can see that here the transient gets a little bit messed up. It goes higher here. And if you're making music that is meant to be this loud, every little bit counts, right? So you can see this patch, we just go to 0 right here, and then it goes back up again. And so you get this very, very square waveform, even at the transients. Now the reason why it goes to 0 actually has to do with this here. So this curve is determining our volume in here and in here. Now this isn't fully precise, so there might still be some bleeding out, there might still be some phasing from this big EQ band here. So this is kind of like a secondary making it silent, making sure that when the note stops playing, when this note, this MIDI note, comes to this point, that it actually turns off and kills that voice, make sure that it's silenced there so that the next note can start to play. As I said before, if you don't do that, you get these like weird fluctuations of your transients, which is really not needed, right? It doesn't really add anything having your transient kind of messed up like that. And in fact, I would argue that it makes the sound less impactful because there's not really a lot of punch to the transient. If you have a transient like this, where it becomes silent right before it, right here, then this is like a big increase in volume. So you really feel that punch. Whereas if we look at this other kick here, it's not really there, especially when you go to like the faster rolls. I think that this is the best example here. Here it's already loud, so there isn't really that punch, that impact that you would like to get from a kick transient. Now for the regular viewers of my channel, you might know that I talk a lot about phase, and phase also comes into account right here. If you're going to mess with the phase between the harmonics, then you're going to mess things up. And I can quickly show you an example. What a lot of people would do is they would use an EQ to remove any frequency that plays below the sub, right? Removing all of the rumble. What they also might do is do some EQing work like I've done here. Now you'll notice that this is a very special EQ in that it's linear phase, and there's actually a very good reason for that. If I were to deactivate this EQ and I wanted to add an EQ here, for example, and let's just say I'll take this and I'll remove a little bit of the rumble. I'll use the same bands to increase the sub a little bit, and I'll make a few more edits in here just to, beef up the sound a little bit. Then just for us to compare the waveforms, I'm going to record this waveform again here. This patch is just a lot louder and it's all phasey. All of the transients are messed up. You can see that the waveform completely changes, and this is all because of the phase shift. And you can actually hear the difference if we play the difference between this . And you can actually hear the difference. So for the sake of not having to switch between tracks with all of this large latency plugins that are the linear phase plugins, I'm just going to play it like this. And you'll hear the difference between this first part and the second part. Notice how much more definition the kick has in the second part. even though it's a lot quieter, technically. Of course, there's different EQ settings on each and every one, but the main culprit here is this low pass filter, because the lower you get into the spectrum, the more phase shift actually affects the waveform, because the oscillations take longer. So for 180 degree phase shift, which is what happens at the filter cutoff of a high pass filter like this, you will find that around the sub bass, that shift is a lot longer, because the sub bass needs a lot more space to oscillate once. So you can imagine if you flip the sub bass, then you get a completely different waveform. In fact, I would argue that for the high end and even for the mid range like this, it doesn't really matter what kind of EQ you use, as long as you keep your sub bass kind of clean of normal EQs and just use linear phase EQs like this. The final thing that I wanted to show you has to do with adding extra tone to it, and this is where this one comes in. Now this one is the least gritty one, I would say, but I think it's the most interesting one, because in the synthesis you'll see that there's actually an extra waveform. Now this is just in there so that I can layer two waveforms together, but you can hear that something like this definitely changes the tone of it. Obviously it's going to sound better if I enable the tone, because I designed this kick to have this tone in here. I did need to do a little bit of cleanup in the high end, which is what this filter is for, controlled by this modulation here. But you can see that we have the same idea here of this peak going into a distortion. In this case I went for the asymmetrical distortion, because that's what I liked on this one. I had some control set up here for both of these macros. This one is for the gain, this one is for the frequency, so I can play around with it and experiment a little bit more. And I think when it comes to the synthesis, what you'll hear often in like the fills, where the kick kind of goes crazy with this grittiness, is where you would modulate the filter position of this one individual peak that is causing all of this grittiness from the distortion. Now you can see again in the waveform I'm not following my own advice, and you can see that there's some very small post-ringing in here. You can see the transient kind of bumping up towards the start here where this waveform exists. And the reason for that is probably has to do with this EQ, as well as the fact that I'm actually not using any volume here apart from just setting the release to 0. What you would ideally do is set this like this, and then not have an EQ curve like this. Probably even go as far as to remove the second one as well. And if you really want that, you can implement that in here. I think it was something like this, I guess. Now we should see a much cleaner waveform. I might be missing something still. Let's have a look at our volume over here. Yeah, we can set this to 0 a little bit earlier. And that should do the trick, hopefully. There still seems to be some post-ringing. It's probably the fact that I'm using this bass boosting here. Now this is preparational for the distortion, so I cannot actually place it after this. I'll let you hear what happens if you place it after this. It completely changes the tone. For that I'm actually going to boost the gain here so you can hear the difference. You can hear that the distortion really changes its characteristic depending on the spectrum that you're pushing into it. So that's going to be it for today. As I said, it was a little bit of a different video. I found a cool sound design technique and I hope that you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if you enjoyed it by leaving a like, and if you're new here and you want to see more of what I do, which as I said is usually regarding psytrance and not so much hardcore, then make sure that you're subscribed. And if you want to get notified by YouTube whenever I upload something, then make sure that you turn on the bell notifications. But I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.